Today marks World Refugee Day. According to the United Nations, every minute 24 people escape war, persecution or terror. Forced displacement has reached unprecedented levels, with more than 65 million people uprooted from their homes globally. New and recurring conflicts are driving people to flee in search of safety within their own countries or to cross international borders as asylum seekers or refugees. At the end of 2015, there were 21.3 million refugees, 3.2 million people in the process of seeking asylum, and 40.8 million people internally displaced within their own countries. 9 out of 10 refugees are today living in poor and middle-income countries close to situations of conflict. Sub-Saharan Africa hosts more than 26% of the world's refugee population. According to the United Nations, more than 1 million refugees and migrants arrived in Europe across the Mediterranean in the year 2016. New and recurring conflicts are forcing people to flee their home, hoping for a better life abroad. South Sudan boasts the largest refugee crisis in Africa. And joining us live in our Midrand studios as well as via Skype, we are joined by Emeka Johnson, Head of Communication and Public Relations at the African Diaspora Forum, as well as Carly Kane, who is a migration lawyer at the Craig Smith and Associates. And joining us via Skype is James Alder, who is the Regional Chief of Communication at UNICEF. A very good morning to you all. Thank you so much for joining us here on Morning Prime. Let's first start with our in-studio guest, Mr. Johnson. We hear about the refugee crisis all over the world, and as I stated earlier, every minute 24 people escape war, persecution or terror. A very scary thought here. But let's bring it home to Africa and South Africa. I understand that you have some estimates on the number of refugees in the country at present. Can you update us on that?
Yeah, at present in South Africa, we don't have a figure of the number of refugees, but it is enormous from what we are seeing. And that is one of the challenges. We have been interfacing with the government to see if they can allow us to give us the opportunity to do the study. Because even the government, South African government, Home Affairs, cannot tell you this is the number of refugees that are in South Africa. And that is one of the big challenges Home Affairs is facing. But from our own estimates, we can say that we have close to 2-3 million refugees in South Africa.
Sure, that really is a lot. Let's turn now to Ms. Kane. What protection is given to the refugee community? How does the law versus what it says on paper versus in practice compare to how they are protecting those refugees in South Africa?
Thank you, Lauren. The South African Constitution is one of the most advanced and respected constitutions in the world, and it enshrines the right to equality for all. It does not specify that only citizens are entitled to equality. The Constitution specifically states that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, and this, along with other marginalized sections of the community, includes refugees. We also have legislation that encapsulates those rights of human dignity and equality. And on paper, our law is well suited to protect refugees and asylum seekers. The problem that we find is that there's a disconnect between the law as it is on paper and the way that the law is applied in practice. And what we often find is that the law is applied in a crude manner, often with little discretion or little compassion to the plight of refugees. And as immigration attorneys, we are often faced with situations where refugees are treated in a manner that does not align with the Constitution, where people are not allowed to apply for an immigration status in South Africa, where people are told that they may not marry if you're an asylum seeker. And that is not the way that the Constitution envisions us treating refugees and asylum seekers. And so on World Refugee Day, I think the most important thing for us to consider and for us to ask for is that the law is applied with the spirit of the Constitution, in that refugees need to be treated with respect and with compassion, and that we need to reach out to refugees and treat them in the way that we are expected to in terms of our constitution.
Now, why is this law not applied accurately?
It's a difficult question to answer. The law is applied in a very cutthroat way, very often. And the Department of Home Affairs often doesn't, as I say, apply any discretion or compassion. And I know compassion is not a word that you often associate with a strict legal word, but when it comes to refugees, that's exactly what should be happening. These are people who have escaped the fear of murder and torture and the destruction of everything that they know. And that's why we need the Department of Home Affairs and all the officials involved to apply the law in a way that enshrines the right to equality, that enshrines the right to human dignity, at the very least, human dignity.
Now, let's turn now to Mr. Alder, who's the Regional Chief of Communication at UNICEF. How is the country addressing this lack of social cohesion amongst refugees, the migrant community and citizens? We've heard from a legal expert, now from just on the ground.
Well, I'd turn the attention. I agree with what your previous speakers spoke of in terms of countries welcoming those people who've endured so much. And the good news is that there are examples of really progressive, open-door refugee policies happening right here in the region. I mean, the world's attention, of course, is captivated by the refugee crisis going on in Europe. But there's a country in our region who has absorbed more refugees from a single country than Europe has from across the world in the last 12 months, and that country is Uganda. We're looking at 1,000 children entering Uganda as refugees every day. And as your other panelists have spoken about today, it's important not to see them as victims, but their efforts have been quite heroic. They've experienced things that we hope none of our friends and family or children will ever have to endure. Last week when I was on the Ugandan-South Sudan border, I met young girls who are literally broken. Perfect English, 2 or 3 languages, doing wonderfully well at school. They've lost everything. Family members, school, often they've been sexually abused, and they've arrived broken into Uganda. And yet Uganda, despite having absorbed around 750,000 refugees from South Sudan last year alone, has this incredibly open, progressive, generous refugee policy. They don't set up camps. People immediately go into settlements. They go in with host communities. Organisations like UNICEF and UNHCR and World Food Programme ensure that there is adequate water, solar panelling, education, classrooms, teachers, food, obviously. So it's a policy, I think, that a lot of other countries in the region, particularly globally, though, can take a look at. This is a lower middle income country that really has a progressive policy that looks at refugees in terms of what they've endured, but also the incredible things they've done to survive and to get out of their country and to bring their families to safety. And it then tries to settle them and giving them the best chance not only to become part of that broader community, but then, as we've seen time and time again, and there are numerous studies on this, that to add to the community, that to add to the bottom line, to add to the economy, which is generally what refugees from South Africa all the way to the United Kingdom and New Zealand tend to do over 5 to 10 years, so long as they are given an opportunity.
Now, the International Organization for Migration has criticized countries, politicians, and even the media for failing to communicate the challenges faced by migrants and the inability to sometimes integrate into multicultural societies in the modern era of globalization. Does UNICEF share the same sentiment here?
I think UNICEF's position is very clear across the world. We have seen time and again the value that an open and a legal system of migration offers. We know that when migration policies are extremely closed and when countries don't offer any opportunity for people to move legally, they will still move illegally. Migration is a phenomena from Africa to the Americas to Europe that has gone on for thousands of years and will continue to go on. When countries have policies and open procedures that people can access legally. People will do it. When they don't, they will do it illegally, which we see time and again pushes them into the hands of smugglers, and a smuggling trade, which is a huge business now, is also closely linked to a human trafficking trade. That is something UNICEF can't tolerate. We have pushed very clearly with governments from this region, but increasingly from Europe, to ensure that there are policies in place that can allow children and their families to move safely. And when that occurs, we again find that the impact on the broader community, the host community, and on the refugees is very positive. But when it's not, we have situations like we have now of people moving through Somalia or through Libya or through West Africa, doing so illegally and very quickly falling into the hands of smugglers, and then very quickly falling into human traffickers. And that, as I'm sure your viewers will know, is a very dark world for children to encounter.
Definitely. Let's turn back to Mr. Johnson. Refugees around the world are byproducts of war, military coups, massive human rights violations, political instability, and even environmental change. In terms of refugees fleeing to South Africa, what is the main reason for them doing so, coming here?
The issue is that the continent itself has been have a field day of refugees. You can see, you heard what he said about Uganda receiving that huge number of refugees. South Africa actually is not a very good destination for refugees, but countries like Uganda have done better in the refugees issue. Like my previous speaker have said, you asked initially what is the reception level. The reception of refugees in South Africa is very, very poor. South African policies have actually failed woefully in handling of refugees. The pull factor might be the intention, the intention that, or the belief that South Africa provides a more conducive, stable political structures and economic welfare. But the realization when you get here is quite different. It's quite wrong. You start having your problem from the refugee reception offices. Imagine the whole of South Africa have only 2 refugee reception centers. The huge size of South Africa. Only 2 refugee reception centers. It's a crazy hell there. Try to go to Marabastad. Marabastad is inside Pretoria. Go there, it's a crazy hell there when you get there. The intention is that this is a new democracy that we offer, and they have the infrastructures and the facilities to offer succor to refugees. But it's actually a different ballgame when you get here. Like the last speaker have said, in as much as South Africa signed, is a signatory to the UN Convention, they have failed in their duties. Generally, the Home Affairs has failed. We have interfaced with the Home Affairs over time to know the enormous backlog. In fact, there are processes you are supposed to go, and these processes are scattered. For example, there should be an appeal board, there should be a screening board, there should be a reception board. What you can see is only the reception board. You see people, once you're given the section 22, which is asylum seekers by the RSDOs, you're supposed to stay 1 to 3 months, but people have stayed under that status for 10 years.
And even in a country that, as we were speaking earlier, kind of rejects these refugees with only 2 centers.
After 10 years, you are rejected. After 10 years, you are rejected. Where do you go from there? And that 10 years, you are not supposed to take employment. How do you survive? It's, in most countries, refugees are taken care of. They are given camps, they are given shelter, they are given food, passes, sometimes stipends.
Now, obviously, a World Refugee Day is trying to address these kinds of issues within South Africa. Now, it's the 17th World Refugee Day. How has South Africa seen any progress with regards to this?
I've not seen any progress in the refugees. I have never seen any progress. We are supposed to have, there is what they call the brown paper, the brown book. They are supposed to be given if you are accepted. Ask the Department of Home Affairs. I would have loved them to be here. Ask the department how many brown books, how many refugees do they have? They will not tell you. How many asylum seekers do they have? There's a section 22. How many have mutated from section 22 to section 24 permits? They won't give you that. There is an imaginary panel or board they call the SCRA. The SCRA is supposed to be, it's non-existent. Go to Home Affairs and ask, where is the office of the SCRA? When do they sit? You can't get it.
Does not exist.
You can't get it. And if you are rejected, you are arrested immediately. We are supposed to be given time to appeal. We are not given time to appeal. Go to Lindela. Lindela has turned to a refugee camp. People are kept there. You are not supposed to be more than 1 month or 3 weeks at Lindela. Go to Lindela, some people have been there 5 years. That's why we are even in court with lawyers for human rights against DHA, Department of Home Affairs. With the Supreme Court, we're expecting a judgment that the illegal arrest of migrants.
Now, Ms. Kane, let's turn to you now. From a legal perspective, what can South Africa do to address these issues?
Well, I think, as I've said earlier, the most important thing is that the Refugee Act is applied with the spirit that it was meant to be applied with. Reading that with the Constitution and really seriously and genuinely applying the constitutional values. If we don't apply those values, we are a lost cause. Because the very nature of refugees is someone who is displaced, who has nowhere else to go. And if we as a society cannot welcome them with genuine sincerity and treating refugees with the respect and with the dignity that they deserve, we're not going to get anywhere. Like my colleague says, the state of the Department of Home Affairs and the way that they treat our refugees and our asylum seekers is deplorable. It is shocking, and we see it on a daily basis. People who are lost, they contact us and they say, I've lived here for years, I've built an entire life here, and all of a sudden I'm expected to go where? I've got nowhere to go. And if our legal system doesn't start applying the values that it should have been applying all these years, I don't know
it's just downhill
if it's going to get any better.
Let's turn now to James Alders, Regional Chief of Communication at UNICEF. It's the 17th World Refugee Day. What does it aim to achieve this year round?
Well, a couple of things. I think, as both your guests are speaking about, just a greater appreciation for what refugees have been through, what they offer countries. I do think that the maxim of this idea that you can judge a society by the way it treats its most vulnerable, and obviously its most vulnerable are those who have fled horrible persecution, in many cases violence, and of course their children. Children are not responsible for anything that political leaders do. They are most clearly victims in this. So I think one is just to build empathy. It's very important. The numbers, as you said at the start of your program, are really startling, and we can go on and on and on. Each one of those numbers does wear the face of a mum or a dad or a 9-year-old girl who is simply trying to do their best for the family, as all your viewers are. So I think once we break down the numbers and we remember that these are individual stories, that's a very large part. A second thing, of course, is simply around funding. When I talk about Uganda, or whether it's Ethiopia or Kenya, countries in East Africa who absorb the great burden of the refugee crisis in this part of the continent, they are deeply overstretched. If Uganda is taking 2,000 refugees a day, then obviously the pressure that's put on social services, from education to health to water, is extreme. So the international community does need to find ways to fund this. This is about decent human rights. It's also a question of simple security. The funding needs to occur where UNICEF is well aware of refugee crises from Syria to Jordan to, of course, our part of the world. But nonetheless, these people, it's important to remember, have done so much to protect their families. They're not sitting around waiting for aid. They've often walked 5-7 days. They've endured 2 months in their country or 2 years before they've had to flee. And then they've fled under brutal circumstances. And so they're literally got to a point where they simply require some support, a leg up. And I don't think anyone would deny that idea for someone who's been through so much and then simply needs a little bit of support so that they can again look after their family and become an active member of a community. So I think those simple two
Mr. Elder,
aspects.
unfortunately, I have to cut you off there as we are out of time, but thank you so much. James Elder there, the Regional Chief of Communication at UNICEF. I'd like to also thank Carly Kane, migration lawyer at Craig Smith and Associates, as well as Emeka Johnson, the Head of Communication and Public Relations at the African Diaspora Forum. Time now for a short break. We'll be back with more news and updates after this. Don't go anywhere.